And I want to welcome Janet.
Thanks for having me in your home.
That's what it is. It's a home, a safe gathering spot. I call it the open field, actually. I call it the open field after Rumi, the poet, mystic, Persian mystic, who said, out beyond right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And I added, like, out beyond right doing, wrongdoing, out beyond shame, guilt, fear, and judgment, there's an open field. I'll meet you there, and that's where Architects of Change gather. So welcome.
Beautiful. Thank you.
So, and welcome to all of you, and thank you, Rick, for that beautiful introduction, and congratulations to you for all the work you're doing and the road ahead, which requires all of us to check our judgments at the door, be open-minded and open-hearted, and that's really the goal of these conversations, Janet. So I want to welcome her here, for sure, an architect of change, surpassing certainty. I've had a lot of trouble getting to certainty, so I'm really interested in how you surpass it. So I would like to start there. I'm always struggling with, am I certain about this? I'm not sure, am I certain? And I look at her book and it's like, surpassing certainty. So I actually would like to start with, what does that mean, surpassing certainty?
So I have to credit the queen of everything for me, which is Audrey Lorde, Black lesbian feminist, poet extraordinaire, blueprint, literary everything. And she has this really wonderful quote where she talks about the certainty of the only thing that we can be more sure is that it's more dangerous to not speak than to speak. Right. So speaking one's truth.
That's how you actually start the book. And this book is really great. In the beginning, it says, and the speaking will get easier and easier, and you will find you have fallen in love with your own vision, which you may have never realized you had. And you will lose some friends and lovers and realize you don't miss them. And new ones will find you and cherish you. I love this. And you will still flirt and paint your nails, dress up and party, amen. And at last, you'll know with surpassing certainty that only one thing is more frightening than speaking your truth, and that is not speaking. And which I think is so beautiful. And you had to come to a place in your own life where you confronted that.
Completely. Yeah. And so I think that going back to what you opened up with, the piece of saying that you were trying to come to certainty, I think that it's not about being certain. I think it's about going beyond that space, going in the space in which you are completely okay with being uncertain, completely okay with knowing that there are going to be new terms and definitions, that there are going to be new identities, new kinds of people who are going to challenge you and check you, that a lot of that will have to come in a space of recognizing your own humbleness and smallness in the world, that your own experience, though vital and important to you going out and doing the work that you do, that there are also going to be people who you're going to meet and cross paths with, who are going to challenge you, who are going to make you think differently about yourself, who are going to blow up your norms. You know, I can think about my husband, Aaron. When he met me, he was not planning to meet me, but he met me. And I think it shifted and challenged all of the way in which he thought about gender, about the body, about love, about the limits, about the ways in which we expand on that.
Right.
And so for me, I think so much of this book is about the time in my life when I chose silence, because silence was the way in which I learned through the world in order to gain access into spaces, to be able to be seen and heard. I had to be silent about pieces of my identity, pieces of my experience. And I needed that time to process, to be quiet.
Did you really choose silence, or did you not know that you could choose speaking out?
I think it's both. I think I chose it because I never saw someone else like me, a trans woman, a young trans woman of color, thriving in the world. So I didn't have a portrait of what that possibility could be. I didn't know it was a possibility, but I dreamt it. And so a part of getting toward that dream, navigating that road, was by being silent and saying, let me just be quiet about this piece of my identity and try to just deal with being Black and young and a woman in the world without having to throw on the additional stigma-filled identity of being trans, at least at that time.
You said that it's surpassing certainty is about being uncertain and being okay with that. And I think that many people, we talk about architects of change as people who challenge what is, imagine what can be, kind of see it, create it, and move humanity forward. But our perception of those people is that they're certain about what they're doing, that they're confident, that they've got it together and they can do it. And since we're uncertain, we're afraid because they seem bigger than life. So you come off as certain.
Well, I'm certain that I don't know everything. So I think that so I think that there's a vulnerability in that, which, and I think that also what Audrey Lorde has taught me is to be vulnerable is also powerful. And so for me, it's not so much that I have to have all the answers, that I have to be completely black or white on any kind of issue. I also know that none of us are just one or two things, that we're multiplicities, that we're many things. And so on certain days, parts of my identity and experiences ring louder or communicate louder, like this phone is communicating to us right now. And so, and we're uncertain of who's calling.
That's right.
And it could be,
he didn't pick them up.
Who knows?
But you talk in here, Janet, which I'm really interested in. You said one of the goals that you are really striving for is to get beyond, to surpass the otherness that people associate you with. And I was saying that I, too, often try to get beyond that otherness. Are you accomplishing that?
I don't think so. Not yet. I think, I was born into the world othered, growing up,
What does that mean, others?
Other to me, I think that not necessarily being centered. And so like always having an identity or an experience that was somewhat marginalized in some sense. So I don't think, I'm not a cisgender person, I'm a trans person. But before I even learned that about myself, before I gained certainty in knowing the terms and the labels to put onto my identity to define myself, I knew that I was a black child in America that grew up in low-income communities. So I knew that I was black and poor. I didn't yet know that I was a girl or a woman. I didn't yet know I was trans. And then that became a part of my identities. And so in a sense, I have always been on the perimeter looking in. All of the pop culture that I consumed rarely looked like me or rarely spoke to me deeply, but it was what I had, so I took it in. And so in that sense, I've always had a perspective that was just a little outside, and I always wanted to be in. And then lots of, this story is about the hunger to be included, the hunger to gain more, to know more, to gain access, to gain power and influence, to be able to shift and change the ways in which stories like mine are told. And so I think that a part of the work that I have to do is to come to a point where it can just stand on the work. Like rarely am I asked about the writing process as a writer. I'm always asked about, my book is then a launching pad to talk about political issues in trans communities or...
Okay, let me ask you about the writing.
Okay.
Because you consider yourself, and you are a writer. And so what is your process, and why did you want to write this book? You had already written a memoir, so you had come forth and told your story. So why did you want to write, and what do you get out of that process?
Well, I think that there were a lot of misconceptions about me. So I came out in 2011, told my story publicly. I was an editor at People magazine. I was 27 years old at the time. I then began writing my first memoir, which was largely about my childhood and teenage years, transitioning, mostly about grappling with my body and my identity and trying to figure out how to find some kind of contentment within that. And then I went and promoted that book, and it went everywhere, and it just was like all over the place. And
that made you an activist in a way.
Yeah.
A speaker on behalf of.
Which is strange and problematic on so many layers, because I am just a single person with a single experience that cannot speak completely to every single trans person's experiences. There's so many parts of my identity as a trans person. So when people hear trans people, they think that, I can come in and then talk about all trans people, but transness is not a monolith, right? And so there's non-binary people, there's, disabled folk, you say there's all of it. Yes.
What does that mean? Whoa. That's other. I don't know. What's that? What was that?
That's like a yes. It's it's an affirmation.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Right. Okay. We're okay.
Let's do it. Yes.
Let's do it. Okay. Woo. Okay. So we're back to the writing. So you wanted to write that first book.
Yes.
And tell your story. So why did you want? I know for me, I find when I write, I find clarity. I
Yeah,
find
completely.
certainty in a way, actually, when I write, even if it's never published.
Yeah.
And
I feel
is
my
that your
strong-
process too?
Yeah, I feel my strongest in words when I'm sitting by myself, staring at a blank page, which is really challenging and scary, but at the same time really liberating, because I always end up filling that page. And there's something that I figure out in that process. There's takeaways that I have in writing about certain, happy experiences or traumatic experiences, whatever the experiences are. But I end up at the end of the page or at the end of a legal pad notebook with some sense of clarity about how I feel about myself in the world. And so this book came out of being invited to a women's writers residency called Hedgebrook in Washington State on Whidbey Island. It's amazing. And they invited me in the midst of my first book tour, and they were like, we want you to come and have space to figure out what you want to write next. And I was like, I have something else to write again?
Yeah,
I have another book. I just finished this book.
Did you feel do you feel?
I was super insecure, so I didn't.
So you didn't know if you had a second book in you?
I didn't, but I knew that. So then when I took the invitation and went into that space and into a room of my own with no Wi-Fi, with no obligations, with my away message up on my emails, I faced myself. I sat and I cried. I read books. I sat and talked with other women. And then I found myself coming to these years in my life when I wasn't so sure, when I was in process, when I didn't have answers, when I was seeking, when I was desiring, when I was wanting to share myself and show myself, but then also was concealing myself.
So did that end in your 20s?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're not like seeking and...
No, I'm still seeking, desiring, wanting things or experiences, but I think that it was always paired with concealing or hiding parts of myself,
so
and that I ended.
So I think what's kind of really interesting about this book, and it's what your 20s, it's the subtitle is what my 20s taught me.
That's a marketing thing, because it's really just 19 to 25.
Okay, but it's what your 20s
but
taught
it's
you.
cute. Yeah.
And it's very similar. It works. It's what I think is kind of, to me, interesting is that it's universal. This is not other. So much as, it's very similar experiences that I might have had in my 20s or other people. What did you...
Wait, what were your 20s? What were your 20s
They were like,
Maria?
I'm the interviewer. I'm not gonna...
This is a safe field, right? Aren't we in a field
we're
galloping?
In a really
Aren't
safe
we
field.
Skipping together, sharing?
Yeah, we're skipping in our minds. That's right. I'll tell you later. Okay. It is interesting. Anyway, but what did you want? I mean, is this for kids getting out of college? Why should I buy this book for my kids who are in their 20s?
Well, I think that for me, there are the universal similarities of leaving home for the first time, going to college, problematic roommate stuff, internships, grad school, starting your career out. And so for me, I think it's all about the sense of the question I kept on getting asked as I was promoting my first book was, how do I bring my full self to the spaces that I enter and that I occupy and that I have access to? I think
From everybody you got that question.
Oftentimes, yeah. There was this sense of I'm coming on this campus to talk about my intersectional identities as a trans woman of color who's working in media. Right. And so
yeah.
And so young people were kind of so once we leave this safe space of college that we've crafted and created for each other, where we can do the snaps and we're in community and we have the right language, and then we graduate from this space and we leave this safe space and we go out into the world, the quote unquote real world, where these safe spaces don't exist, how do I then bring all of my experiences and myself to the spaces that I'm occupying? And I found myself going back to being a young person when I didn't have the answers on that. And so part of this is to provide some kind of a roadmap onto how to do it, but then also how not to do it.
Right.
And so a lot of that comes with compromises and experimentation and, trusting people and being vulnerable, but then also at the same time having exacting boundaries, about being clear about your vision, about what you want in the world, and then also knowing deep down or internalizing on some level that you're deserving of all the things in the world and that you don't need to just go for the crumbs that people say because you're othered, that you need to go for.
Right. So that the line, you're deserving of all the things in the world. We hear that a lot, but how do you actually let that in? How do you actually make that a reality? I say that to my kids and they're like, yeah, right.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I mean, it sounds good.
Yeah.
And it's true. But how did that land in you?
Well, it was a process of also taking crumbs, taking what was given to me, internalizing images and stereotypes and the limitations that people thought that I would be able to do in the world, right? And so, you know, I was the first person in my family to go to college on both sides, got a scholarship to go to college, went on to grad school, accomplished all of these things that people said I would never do as a, you know, Black trans girl. And I just kept on exceeding these expectations. There was a part of me that was like this deep hunger and ambition to the point of like stupidity at times, meaning like making these grand sacrifices, but then also taking...
What was the ambition for?
I don't know. I think it was probably a seeking of wanting to fill some gap in me or some space in me that was learned, right? The sense of something must be wrong with me because I'm this way, right? So like, I'm not immune. I was never, as a young person, immune to that. You know, I spoke my truth at 12 years old, saying that I'm trans. I then went headfirst into transitioning without resources. And so a lot of that there's a lot of...
How extraordinary is your mother, by the way?
She is.
I mean, when reading this, that your mother heard you, listened to you.
She let me lead the way.
I mean, as a mother myself, I reading that, I was like, wow.
Yeah. And also I think it also just is context of space. She's Native Hawaiian. She grew up in a culture where there was a space, you know, we were talking about the gender spectrum a little bit earlier, where there's a space, beyond just male and female, where there was a gender nonconforming space. There was a space called mahu, an identity that we could name and that we knew. You know, my parents may not have known transgender as a term, but my mother knew mahu. She knew that my dance teacher in the 7th grade was mahu, that she was trans. And so knowing that there is some, you know, that your child, that there's a name for your child in some sense, that there's something that's also not just you seeing it on television. You also see a person that you know that's trans. And so at least there's a tolerance level because they knew that it existed. And so she wasn't scared in that sense. I think she was more scared and afraid for my safety in the world, thinking about you being trans, what will that mean to other people? Yes, it's great in this safe space of our home, but what does it mean when you go to school and teachers start saying stuff and sending you home because of dress code and pushing you out of restrooms and all of this stuff, which did happen to me. But I think that my mom trusted her child. She trusted that she had a smart child who knew who she was. And so her job was not to instill more fears in me, but to make me feel as if I was deserving of all the things, right? That I was deserving of being able to show up to school as how I wanted to dress and present, that I could still then be treasurer of my sophomore class, that I could still play tuba in the marching band first chair, that I could, you know, be captain of the volleyball team.
Come on.
You know, that I could, do all that stuff. And so, it was great that I had a parent, but most people don't have.
Right, I was going to say, so kind of to anybody who's in their 20s, still struggling, perhaps still in the crumb stage, still in the silent stage, and to a parent who might have a child like that, what would be your advice?
You know, I'm not a parent.
Right. I am, so I'm asking.
Yeah, no.
I don't have a kid.
I'm just thinking in the sense that
wondering.
it's not my experience, but I can speak as a child what I needed.
Yeah.
Right, and what helped me. So having a parent that nodded and affirmed me when I spoke my truths, when I came to a point to say that I'm ready to share this with you. She didn't project her fears onto me, which as an adult, I'm sure she had, thinking about, she went from A to Z, right? Like my child came out as trans and now she's going to go have bottom surgery and date men or something. And she's going to be in danger. My mom didn't do that to me. Instead, she just like understood it'd be baby steps. And so she let me lead the way, which I think was great. She didn't tell me that it was a phase, that I may change my mind. She didn't try to fix me or manipulate me. She also didn't pathologize me, which I think is oftentimes what happens to a lot of trans youth, in the sense of like, well, then we need to take you to a doctor to make sure that you're sure on this. She trusted that I was certain about who I was. And I think that it also, you know, the way I write about my mom in my first book, Redefining Realness, is I also contextualize it in the sense of she also had that kitchen table conversation with her mother at 16 when she had to tell her that she was pregnant with my older sister. And so her mother nodded and affirmed her. She didn't go and scold her and tell her that she was wrong. She said, we need to go take care of you. So now let's go make sure that you're healthy. Let's make sure your baby's okay. You know, let's figure out a way we're going to tell your damn dad about this. You know, let's plot together.
That's really a universal, what I like about what you're saying here is that's a universal lesson. What kids need to hear, what parents need to model. And that is an incredible gift, right, of being able to do that. And that, in a way, that's what you're also doing, is, you know, you said you're not a parent, but you're showing the way. You're nodding in affirmation to people who pick up this book and your other book. And you're showing that they don't have to be silent for as long, perhaps, as you were, because there was no path.
And then also, if they choose silence, that's completely okay too, because their story is their own, right? I think another piece of this, and a lot of people talk about the disclosure conversation around transness, around, you know, specifically dating, and, you know, so you didn't tell everyone that you were trans in every space that you went into. And I was like, how relevant was it in most of the relationships and, you know, being at work? Or it wasn't relevant to those spaces. I was an editor at a magazine, so I did my job as an editor at a magazine. My identity as a trans person and my story of becoming wasn't relevant to that space.
Did you feel, though, that when you were doing that you were being silent, withholding, that...
In a lot of intimate relationships, I felt more in that space where I had great friendships and I didn't trust my friends enough to share myself with them, to invite them into knowing me better and deeper.
So I have, as I said, kids in their 20s, and so there's a lot of conversation with young people about the spectrum, the gender spectrum. And I hear kids often talking about, like, why don't they just come out to me? Or why don't they just say what they're doing? Or do you ask? And what is the etiquette, or what should everybody just sit back and wait till people come figure it out on their own?
You mean in the sense of just a
Well,
random
I find
person
a lot
or someone
of
in your life?
Kids who are friends with other kids who see them experimenting on the gender spectrum, and they say, why don't they just come out and say, I'm trans? Why don't they come out and say, I'm gay? Why don't they come out, so to speak? Don't they trust me? And I would always say to them,
it's not
they don't
about
know.
you, boo. You know, like, and then I think the next layer is that, you know, people, and they may not feel as if they need to share that part of themselves, and that maybe just expressing themselves the way that they're expressing or experimenting how they're experimenting that day is fine. And I also think that we have to flip it in the sense of we don't ask people who are not othered to come out and to declare themselves to us.
Right.
And so I think that that's, and if people are curious, you can also ask.
Right.
In a safe way, in a sense of, you know, hi, I'm Janet and I go by she and her pronouns, and then the other person may go and explain themselves on how the name that they choose, the pronouns that are theirs, and sharing in that way, in the sense of, if you want someone to share with you, then, you know, you do this work in the sense of having conversations with people. You give of yourself in the hopes that they also give of themselves as well.
So we were, in this book, you talk about moments, you call them destiny moments. And people have those moments in your life where you said, where everything is going to change, where everything's going to be different moving forward. How many destiny moments have you had?
I'd say dozens. I'd say, like, probably one of the first most profound was going to New York City for the first time. I knew that that city would change me and give me the space to find myself, and probably feed a lot of that space in me that was seeking and wanting place and wanting to accomplish and all of that
the
stuff.
The ambition space.
Yeah. I'm a little tired now, so I'm ready to move on from there. I think meeting my husband, Aaron, was another space. I knew that relationship would require a lot from me in terms of being vulnerable and sharing myself. in challenging myself and my definitions of what I thought a relationship was, or my images of what I thought a relationship was.
Let me interrupt you here, because we were talking with Aaron earlier, and he said we were talking about your desire to get beyond other. And he said that he knew when he met you that something was going to be remarkable here. And you said to me, he knew something about me before I knew what I was going to become. What did he see in you, and how has that relationship allowed you to step into your story, to your speaking?
Well, I don't know what he saw. All I knew was that I remember one of the moments with Aaron was when we met in the club. I know people don't do that anymore, but we met in the club, pre-Tinder, pre-Grindr, pre-that world. And he, I was a little tipsy.
What's Grindr? That's another one? I don't even know what Grindr is. No, I haven't heard of Grindr.
It's a gay hookup app.
Oh, okay. That's probably why I haven't heard of it. Okay, I was like, woo! Okay, keep going. Oh my God. I was like, I know Tinder, but I don't know Grindr. Okay, that's cool. All right, go ahead. So you met him in a club.
Yes, I met him in a club, and I was tipsy and all that stuff when I met him, and I thought he was very handsome. And he took me out to coffee immediately. We went to coffee. He wanted to sober me up because he wanted to engage with me instead of like engaging with me,
Yeah.
which what I thought we were going to end up doing. And he asked me a question on what I wanted to do with my, like, what do I do for a living? And I was like, oh, I write stories about famous people. And he was like, but what do you want to do? Because he could see that I was being dismissive about my work at People magazine. And I said, well, I want to write stories that matter. And the fact that he even asked me that question and that he pushed me beyond the sound bites that I was very comfortable with sharing of myself, I knew that there was something there, that there was more to explore there, and that this relationship would push me. And so I think he saw things, I don't know, he's also my biggest fan. So it's like, I don't think he's a very objective audience.
So we were talking about strong, powerful women and their partners. And there are so many young women who are told, marry a nerd so you can be like whatever you want to be, or no such thing as a guy if you want to step into a big space, a guy to support you. What's your advice to young women to have a successful partnership and be out there like you are, speaking and writing? And
I think finding a partner. That would be my, I think
that's pretty basic. What kind of a partner?
Well, I think it depends on the relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that for me, I had all these, I grew up on Disney. I grew up with all the romantic comedies you can think of.
He said that you wanted to be in a power couple.
I thought I wanted to be in a power couple, yes.
Yeah,
and so I had these very grand visions of what I thought that was, but it's before I even had any real relationships before, any real partnerships with anyone. And so what does it mean to build a life with someone? What does it mean to share yourself and to know that sometimes, especially in our relationship, in the sense of me doing so much that he also is compromising his own visions in a sense to support me and in my mission. I'm not as giving, I feel, at times. So there are things that we struggle with in partnership, but that's a part of finding a partner, is that you're struggling through this together, but then you're doing this together. This is what you're doing. You're building this home and this partnership. It's hard for me to articulate it.
No, I think
I probably need to go back to my legal pad, but yeah.
So you said that he is supporting you in your mission.
Yes.
What is your mission?
My mission is what I told him the first night was I want to write stories that matter. And so as a storyteller, I want to share narratives about myself, but also about my communities, to figure out ways in which we can know more about each other, but feel more about each other, to the point of that, I am not, you know, as we have these identifiers, I'm a Black trans woman, right? And so it feels so separate from your experience or for someone else's experience. And it's a different experience. But at the same time, you're able to see.
Everybody's experience is different,
yeah,
right?
but you're able to see yourself in someone else's experience just by the fact that they're sitting there and telling their experience to you, and you're finding those common grounds, and you're able to. So for me, it's about those narratives and having that storytelling space, whether that's through my podcast, whether that's through, you know, the HBO documentary, the Transness that I created, all of that stuff. So for me, I just want to continue to tell stories that hopefully challenge and shift the way in which we have these conversations about what it means to live, to be liberated, to have freedom, and to also then get beyond ourselves to help other people have that same sense of liberation and freedom.
But is your mission focused trans or way beyond that? You said to tell stories that matter. Is it general in that way? And if so, 5 years out, how would you characterize yourself successful in that? So like,
I already
my
feel
mission,
I'm successful, but there's so much more that I want to do. But in terms of, for me, it's not just transness, it's also being a Black person and a person of color. That's as integral to my transness is. For me, there's no separating my transness from my womanness, from my Blackness. Like, all of that is a part of all my mission. And so for me, I feel as if I have such a wider audience because I have so many people who should be able to see themselves in my othered experience in some sense. And so for me, success looks like, you know, a girl standing up in a library and saying that she can see herself, and that she feels as if she had access to seeing herself, and that she feels as if she's deserving of being heard and being seen. I know that when I was in the library, for me, it all started from wanting, I was seeking mirrors, I was seeking reflection. And the reason why I write is so that someone else doesn't feel alone and they don't feel like they're the first. Because I think that there's so much pain that comes in feeling isolated and feeling like you're the only. And so for me,
that.
I did, yeah, I felt that. At seventh grade, I got my first library card and had access to books, and I was looking for myself and I was seeking myself, and I found fragments of my reflection in different women's works, but I had never seen myself and my very unique experiences centered. And so for me, I think that being the first in a space is amazing, great accomplishment in that, but I hope that success looks like ensuring that I'm not the only when I leave the spaces. And so that's what success looks like for me.
So your hope is that also that some girl picks this book up in a library and sees herself.
I hope so, yeah.
That's success.
Yeah. And it's already happening. So like, I don't have to do anything else if I don't want to, but I do.
Yeah.
Because I still have that tick-tocky thing in my brain where it's like, I gotta do more, I wanna do more, I wanna be more. So yeah.
So when I call you an architect of change as someone who challenged what is, imagined what can be, and moves humanity forward, what do you think you challenged? What do you imagine? And how are you moving us forward?
I think there's many different ways that I challenge. I think I challenge basicness in the sense of the way in which people want to like be reductive and reduce people to just like one thing. And I think that we are multiplicities, and that's something that I continue to try to integrate in the ways in which I tell my personal story, but then contextualize it out.
So you challenge a narrow view.
Yes.
Okay, what do you imagine?
I imagine a world where we can be so much more than our identities, but our identities are not necessarily forgotten, that we can do and have and seek all of the things, and that we're not limited in that way. And that, you know, just on a basic level, that folk are able to navigate streets, to have access to spaces safely without the threat of harassment or violence or exile, which is happening overwhelmingly in our country.
That's a pretty political mission. So when I ask you again, what is your mission? To tell stories that matter, but also to change some political stuff.
Yeah, the
I
personal
think.
is political though. So as a storyteller, I think I use.
But your story, you're gonna like push some boundaries in the political.
I hope so.
So what do you imagine humanity there? Acceptance. What does that look like to you?
What does acceptance look like?
Yeah.
People minding their own damn business. letting letting people live, right? I feel that so much of our
That's good.
so much of our stuff, so much of the friction comes with people feeling threatened by someone just living out loud and living their life and not necessarily conforming to the ways in which they've learned the world. I know for me, so much of my greatest pains were having to compromise who I knew I was and how I knew myself to be and the things that I wanted to do in the world because someone was going to say something or threaten me, or take something away from me, for just merely being and living my life. And so for me, acceptance looks like letting people live.
And living out loud.
Yeah.
And not worrying what other people say, think, or point to.
Yeah.
Are you at that space?
I am. But I hope to help other people come to that space themselves.
Great. So I'm going to let, that's huge. So it's way beyond just telling stories that matter. It's telling stories that kind of push your boundaries, that might make people a little bit uncomfortable, but allowing people to be and reminding them, hey, it's not about you.
Yeah.
As long as you're not hurting somebody, allow people to live who they are. And that moves humanity forward.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Rick was saying in the beginning. I think kind of equality leads to acceptance, right? So you have to first have equality, and then the next step is really accepting people and allowing them to be who they are. So I'm going to let people ask questions of Janet. You can ask about this book. You can ask about go ahead.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. This is fantastic. Janet, you shared that in your 20s, you let go of hiding out. That is amazing. I'm in my 50s, and I still feel like there's parts of me that are hiding out. So what advice, what things do you have to share with all of us to let go of hiding out?
When you say hiding out, what do you mean?
Being all of ourselves without worrying about what anyone else is thinking, feeling. Well, not feeling, because we want to take that in consideration, but really showing up and being all of ourselves and showing up for our mission in this world, and not worrying about comparing, despairing, like being all of ourselves without dying with the music inside.
So what advice do I have?
Be uncertain. I think what she was saying in the beginning with that exact quote, that you weren't certain, but
Yeah, and I also think that there's no like linear path toward that, right? There's certain times where I think about little decisions that I made today where, you know, when I put on this dress and had my hair braided in the way, I was like, am I doing too much for Maria Shriver? Should I put on just like a white, cute A-line dress? And I was like, no, I'm going to come with a high top shop, you know, high slit, and serve a look. And so, because I feel like
with a hot husband, so it's okay. Go.
And so like this sense of, you know, so there are the many compromises that happen, and sometimes I have to check and challenge myself as well. And so it's not a linear thing, and that it's okay to be in process and to know that right now this is where you're at. And hopefully, you know, I know this is a safe space, but there's also a public space. And so there's probably more exacting terms and more exacting relationships that you're in right now that are holding you back in some way, and really seeing if those relationships are productive for you to be in. I know for me, a lot of the reason why I love that quote in my book from Audrey Lorde is you have to speaking out and being yourself is going to also require some sacrifices. You're going to have to shed some people. You're going to have to shed some relationships. You're going to have to shed some ways in which you've done things, routines, things that make us feel comfortable, but also things that are not.
Change.
Yeah, you got to change. So.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm great.
So good to see you.
You as well. So I had the privilege of meeting you for the first time in New York for the Trans List, and I got to tell you how much of your experience was an opportunity for me to see myself in the world. And as someone who is intentional about having access and control of media messaging and how we're projected and how we're represented, there is an opportunity in that I'm an editor-in-chief for a publication, Wear Your Voice Mag, and I am happy about that opportunity. And but there's a lot of pressure sometimes when you're the first in specific spaces and when you are the visible one. So there's a lot of expectation placed on you by community. And sometimes I find it difficult to make sure that I get everybody's kind of clip in there or their moment in there, and I try to include as many people, but sometimes it just seems impossible. So I guess my question to you is, how do you deal with the pressure of being a representation for a community when there is not too much representation present? And how do you learn how to make it not about you and to just do the best you can?
Well, I think the burden of representation is something that oftentimes people who are othered have to bring in with them. We know that when we enter these spaces, we don't just enter alone, that we carry whole communities of people in with us. And so that there is a duty in that, but at the same time, you can only do so much of what you can do, and you have to be okay in that. And I think that we also need to shift and challenge what we say community is. I think that your community would not, I'm trying to say this right. Your community would not place all of that burden and that load on your shoulders, knowing that you are just one person, and community will also see you as a person, to know that you cannot do all of that work alone, and that you're trying your best, and that you're trying to be inclusive, and that you're trying to include more people. Yeah, did I answer your question? Kind of.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Hey, well, first, I've been calling you Queen Janet in all my text messages to people, so I feel really lucky to be like 5-6 feet away from you. I live in New York City, and I've seen you in the subway a couple times.
Oh yes.
So and like the subway wind was blowing in your hair. You look great. So I'm just really happy to be here, obviously. And my question is, I think a lot of times people make issues of race or compulsory heteronormativity or things around classes like an interpersonal issue, that it means my neighbor is mean to me, or it means that my coworkers don't make me feel safe. When those things are also deeply systemic and structural. Being from New York City, I think a lot about, the gentrification of the West Village and how that really affected poor, queer, trans, young people of color. And so could you speak to some of those structural components of inequity and disparity? And when we talk about imagining, what are some of the structural and systemic changes that need to occur for either equality, reparations, redistribution, whatever. I'm just throwing out. If you want to tack onto any of those words, that's fine.
I don't know if I can answer all that question.
Exactly. But just, to bring it above the interpersonal.
Okay. Yeah, so for me, I can break that out a bit more by just bringing it personal again. I live in Harlem. We just moved there a year ago, and it shifted my consciousness in so many ways, because I realized I hadn't, when I moved to New York the first time, I had left people of color, predominantly people of color communities in Hawaii, in Oakland, and in Dallas. And so then being thrust into a very moneyed white space in NYU and downtown Manhattan, I didn't realize how much that had affected me. And it wasn't until I moved to Harlem where then I got to see, trans, Black and trans Latina girls walking around and existing in communities that supposedly, by larger LGBT mainstream communities, are supposedly more homophobic and transphobic, right? But they're existing and they're there. And so I just thought about the ways in which New York City as a space, the vulnerability of trans women, trans folk of color, whose bodies are out there every single day, and the ways in which we don't really talk about the vulnerability of being out in public space as a trans person. I am able, because of my own privileges, based on the way that I present, the way that I look, things that that are just part of my privileges, part of my package, right? That my transness is not something that is of conversation when I walk into public space oftentimes. And so it allows me a level of safety that's not given to a lot of my gender nonconforming and trans communities, right? People. And I think about the ways in which I have seen and I have witnessed just in countless videos of trans girls on the subway or public transit and people saying stuff or attacking them, and then the people around them who are riding with them say nothing, right? And how in which we believe that because they're existing this way in public by being themselves, that they're deserving of this kind of attention, which is violence, which is harassment, which is the things in which we end up saying a Black, trans, or Latina girl's name, right? And so for me, there is that piece of it that is obviously systemic, right? The sense that Black, trans, and Latino girls should have more people fighting for them, but instead they fall into the cracks of feminist movements, LGBT movements, and racial justice movements, right? So they're not centered in any of those movements. Therefore, the only people who center them are themselves. And so we're talking about underfunded, volunteer-based work, right? You think about the work of Miss Major Griffin Gracie or LA's own Bambi Salcedo.
What they said here, what you talked about in the beginning, right? When he was talking about Equality California, what they're doing too.
They got money though. They're fine. They're okay. Like, I know they need more money to do more work, but there are small grassroots organizations that are trans-led and that are not funded, that are volunteer-based, and that's the systemic stuff. Whereas, you have people of color-led grassroots organizations that are not funded, but that are doing vital work every single day. And for me, it's about figuring out ways that I funnel my energies into ensuring that I'm speaking the names of a Raquel Willis, of Miss Major Griffin Gracie, of Bambi Salcedo, of Elle Hearns, all of these women who are out there doing the work every single day and don't even get a fraction of the attention, visibility, or voice that I'm often granted.
Let me ask you a question about that, because one thing that I, as a journalist and as a citizen, worry about is that we're becoming so fragmented as a society, right? And I read this piece in the New York Times about how Democrats hate Republicans and Republicans hate, and they just hate. Everybody's just, and that people are only watching one kind of media. People are, in Latina neighborhoods and trans neighborhoods and Korean neighborhoods, and there's no crossover, right? There's so little crossover in what we're reading and who we're hearing about, the names you just laid out, right? How do we get together so that we're like talking the same language, hearing about the same heroes? How do we get to people?
Well, I think it's a recognition that, when we say that there's...
Or is this too early to get to people?
Well, I've heard this term sometimes of like speaking across difference, and how do we make sure that we're reaching people to, trans folk have existed for as long as anyone else has existed. Trans folk of color have existed and resisted for decades and still are underfunded. And we're just talking about within the LGBT community, there's these same ills, right? There's racism and sexism and misogyny and transphobia within just our own communities. And a lot of that, I'm going to say a term that people get very uncomfortable with and may not sell books, but white supremacy is real. And so it's, there are the complications around, we've been talking for a long time, we've been educating for a long time. And I think that there's also this sense of, there are the trans, Black, communities or whatnot, but sometimes some of us exist in all of those communities, right? Like, I'm a Black, Native Hawaiian, trans woman, and so I exist across all of them. And so in my own body, in my very existence in the work that I do, I'm speaking and living across difference every day, but people just don't see themselves in me in that same way to then come across their own uncomfortability and to have these difficult conversations, largely because they're scared of saying something wrong. I think there's that piece of it. And I think also largely some people just don't care.
But some people do want to, want to move us out of where we are, right? We have a country now that is kind of separated,
but
fragmented.
It's always been that way though, hasn't it?
I know, but it's worse. And we have more media, people being exposed to it, and we can do better, right? You're trying to tell stories that matter. You're trying to kind of show people a path forward. So whether it's always been that way or not is how can we do better, right? How can we, how can I learn more about a lot of the people that you just mentioned, right? How can
I think in the same ways that I found them.
Right.
I found them online. I went on Tumblr, I went on Twitter. They're accessible. They're there. You know, Raquel Willis spoke at the Women's March on Washington.
Right. Yeah.
So like these people exist. They're there. They're doing this work. They've been doing this work. It's just our attentions are just not there.
Right. So,
and so
all
I think
of
it
us
takes
can, you know, step out and learn something about whether it's all different cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's been a thing that I've started reading a lot more of, that we can, you know, talk to people who have political differences, who grew up differently, who live in different neighborhoods, who watch different shows.
And I think that's largely the work of a lot of people who have a level of access and look to partner and or ally with marginalized folk, is that they can be that bridge. Right. They have the access and the privilege to be able to go and get their people, use the education that they've learned, and then go and get their people and educate.
I think that's what
folk.
this book does. We have any other? Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Just speak up.
First of all, pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you as
to
well.
hear this conversation. And I have to say that having read both of your books,
Oh,
that they're not
already?
only yes,
It's like, oh my God.
not only are they two of the greatest pieces of brave writing that I've ever read, but I think that they're two very important books to the planet. So thank you for that. My question really is, and I don't want to put you in the hot seat of having to speak for everybody, but
She's in there. Go ahead.
you're in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think trans folk, what is the greatest teaching that you think that trans folk can speak to people who aren't in the trans community? What do you think, what is the greatest lesson or the biggest teaching that you think people in the trans community can teach those of us that aren't?
I'm like, do they want to teach people anything? But I do think there is something to learn from a trans person's experience, in the sense of choosing every day to be yourself in a world that's telling you that you're not who you are. It takes great resolve. It takes perseverance to be able to navigate these structures that were not built for you to survive. And so for me, I think being a 12-year-old, just navigating spaces as a gender nonconforming kid was a lot, meaning even just familial spaces. My parents sometimes telling me, don't do that, or smacking me when I did something that did not conform into the ways in which they've learned the world based on the gender binary. And I think that all of us are smacked into our own places symbolically when we step outside of what people expect of us. And I think that that's one of the greatest things that we have to undo and unlearn. And I think it goes back to the parental conversation we were having a little bit earlier about creating more spaces in which people are when they share their truths and when they live their truths, that they're nodded and affirmed and not punished or told to change. And so I think that that would be a through line of a lesson, I guess, for people, I guess.
Right. Go ahead.
Hey, perfect. Hi, how
Hi,
are you? Thank
I'm
you so
good.
much. This has been such an affirming space because of you being here, so I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
I feel that, because in this modern day and age, we have so many people just like you that are role models of color that are giving us so much inspiration that, and I'm not sure if this is, true for everybody, but it means that there are people that are younger, that are going to be more firm, that are going to be reaching that that place of certainty, right? I'm a young adult, I'm 22, right? And I feel that there are a lot of things that you might have had to go through at my age that I will no longer have to go through because of the work that you've been able to do. Right, of course, right? And it's not true for everyone, of course, but I'm interested in what you think those challenges will be for someone that is able to come to that point of certainty earlier, or what kind of challenges we may not have to deal with because we're able to come to a point of certainty at an earlier age.
When you say points of certainty, what do you mean for you?
I mean, in the same way that you said, you've reached your 30s and you are a different person, right? You have reached a point of confidence, right? If I feel at least that I'm at a similar point at this age, what does that mean for me as I continue to, I'm not even, you know, at the mid-20s stage yet, right? So I'm sure there are
And
things
he's
I need
already
to...
certain, and he's like, wow.
Right.
But you're going to meet resistance.
Yeah.
Of course,
To
of
that,
course,
right?
And,
That's
and,
a
I,
piece of
and I'm
it.
sure that I'm not at that point of certainty, right? I'm sure there are more things I need to learn, but I know that there are going to be unique challenges, and I'm interested in what you think, you know, I might have to encounter because I'm reaching a point of certainty and I'm going through a different kind of, you know, context as I make that journey.
Well, I think that, you know, you are going to be met with resistance. You're going to be met with ageism. in the reverse of the sense of folk being like, you're so young, you're a young buck, you need to just slow the fuck down. You know, like, we can swear on Facebook Live, right?
Yeah.
I already did it. Sorry, Maria. And so I think that there will be that sense of, you know, folk who are then trying to figure out ways to contain and police you and keep you in your lane. And so you're going to have to develop tools to resist that, to stick to your vision. I think about the ways in which when I was, you know, I did all the things that feminist movements taught me as a young woman, which was you lean in, you be aggressive, you stick to a plan, and then when you did that, I was punished. I was labeled a diva. I was labeled as, you know, not staying in my lane as a young professional. And that took me a long... It affected me in terms of finding a job, my first job in media. And I remember being frustrated, like, I'm doing all of the things they told me to do. You know, I'm interviewing for these jobs. I have a master's degree. Why am I not being hired? And so I think that you have to be ready and develop tools. And I think part of those tools are also self-care, which involves you being able to surround yourself with people and community who take care of you when you feel battered and beaten up by the world, when you feel doubtful about your purpose and place in it, and ensuring that you have those tools to take care of yourself when you're doubting yourself in these spaces and your certainty is being challenged and checked.
Thank you. You're a queen.
Okay. We have time, I think, for like one more question, right, Michelle? Yeah, one more question. There.
Hi there. This has been so incredible. You just have navigated this whole conversation with so much intelligence and elegance, and you're snatched on top of that.
Oh, man, thank you. Oh, my God.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too, in real life.
Yeah. So my question is, as a woman of color moving about the world as an activist, or not even necessarily an activist, someone who is speaking your truth, I feel like, especially as women of color, we encounter such respectability politics, and that we have to be twice as accurate and compelling with our convictions and our words, and we experience twice as much criticism just for what we say. And so I'm wondering, amidst that criticism, how you stay authentic to yourself and your truth.
Well, I have to, one of the...
Really good question.
Yeah, one big check for me is always, how much am I code switching and or pandering in order to be accepted or brought into a space? And so that's a big check for me. And today was just a very small level of, you know, you gave me a compliment of being snatched, but I was trying to unsnatch myself in order to come into this space and be like, well, I need to be a thought leader. So then I was like, wait, I can be a THOT leader. That's okay.
What is
and so it's you know, it's an unlearning of the respectability politics that we internalize so deeply, right? Which is something that I think that young feminists, millennial feminists are challenging in ways that is very inspiring to me. That, you know, I said this in an interview and I got so much flack for it, but I meant it. I was like, Cardi B and Gloria Steinem are on the same level to me. I was like, you may not think so, but she is doing some liberatory work for a lot of young women of color who only have access to Instagram, right? Who are thinking about ways in which they can show up in the world fully as themselves and not live up to anyone's expectations of them because she is a stripper, because she loves hip hop, because she is quote unquote ratchet, because she's from the Bronx, you know, all of this stuff. And so for me, I am so inspired by that, and it keeps me in line. And so for me, what helps me is finding those little fragments of representation of other women who are resisting and pushing and challenging respectability politics. Because even when I interviewed Representative Maxine Waters, she, at the end of our conversation, she talked about the reason why she said on MSNBC after Bill O'Reilly tried to police her hairstyle and try to dismiss her through her appearance. She said she was clear. She goes, I needed to say that I am a strong Black woman and I will not be intimidated, because she felt as if a lot of millennials thought they were coming to certain spaces and they did everything their parents told them to do. They got all the credentials, they spoke in the right way, they presented in the right way, and still they were not rewarded. And she said she wanted to help release them from that. And I think about the ways in which a lot of our work that we're going to have to do in this generation is to release ourselves from these systems that have told us that we need to perform in ways that are closeness to whiteness so that we can be able to have access to these spaces. And so I think that a lot of our work will be around that. Yeah. Oh, yes. I'm getting applause. We've graduated from snaps.
But I think what's kind of wrapped up in there, double like this. Okay. So what I think is that you yourself, what I heard in that thing where you were wondering about what to wear, you had a doubt. Mm-hmm. You had a moment of doubt, right? And so I think that's when you're saying you're 20, it's okay. And, people who are out there writing books have doubt. Yeah. They're not.
Every day. Every damn day.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's really powerful. That, I think sometimes we think people who've written a book or out there speaking, who are challenging this, writing op-eds, they're way beyond certain. They got it all together. And that it's really okay to have doubt. It's okay to not be sure. It's okay to ask for help or guidance or pick up the book and look for the path. That you're making it up a little bit as you go along too.
Oh yeah, every day.
Yeah,
making it up. Don't listen to me.
No, but that's you're sharing your journey, but you're, you're making it up as you go forward so that someone else might have to make it up a little bit less.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Amen. I just want to introduce Aaron, who is Janet's husband there in the back of the row.
He's very resistant to this.
Yeah. No, but we were talking, I think that for many women out there who might be reading this, who might be in their 20s, think, will I ever have a relationship? Will I be able to be an activist? Will I be able to be a feminist? Will I be able to create the kind of change you're talking about and get a partner? And for guys, the same thing. So I think it's important to acknowledge that he's here with you. Yeah.
He doesn't even like being on my Instagram stories, so I don't.
He doesn't.
This is feeling
he's
like a
here
first.
With your book thing. So I wanna close this out because Janet's gonna sign books, and everybody wants to meet her. But I want to thank you for using your voice, for surpassing certainty, and thinking that your story, having the ambition, really, that you knew your story meant something and was worth telling, and that you have told. So that somebody can go in that library and see herself when you could only see fragments. And that's a success.
Oh, thank you.
Architect of Change, Janet Mock.
Thank you
Surpassing Certainty. Thank you so much for joining. And she's going to sign books.
Thank you, Maria.
First and second.
Thank you for having me.